There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with running out of options. Ava Carter had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether she was going to be sold to a cartel or gamble her life on the most dangerous man in the room. She chose the gamble. What she did not choose, what nobody could have predicted, was that the man she walked toward was the same man whose empire was quietly holding the knife that had already carved her life apart. They called it the Foundry because that is exactly what it was, once. A repurposed industrial furnace buried 3 floors beneath Chicago's South Side, where steel had been forged and poured for decades before the city quietly forgot it existed. Nobody forgets something like that without a reason. Someone had gone through considerable trouble to make sure this particular address stayed off maps, out of records, and far from the kind of conversations that end with warrants. Now, it served a different kind of trade. The heat was still there, heavy, pressing, the kind that sits on your chest and reminds you that the air here belongs to someone else. The lighting was dim on purpose, dim enough for powerful men to sit in comfortable shadow while they made decisions they would never put in writing. Dim enough that the faces watching from the rows of high-backed chairs were more suggestion than fact, their expressions unreadable, their identities protected by the oldest privilege money has ever bought, the privilege of not being seen while seeing everything. There were perhaps 40 of them tonight, buyers in the loosest and most devastating sense of that word. The kind of men who understood that in certain underground economies, human beings move through ledgers the same way commodities do, valued, traded, and written off without ceremony. This is not fiction dressed up as history. Underground human trafficking auctions have been documented across multiple U.S. cities, with law enforcement agencies noting that the buyers are rarely the men you would expect. They are frequently men with clean offices, clean suits, and very dirty money. Ava Carter knew this. She had spent 4 years as a forensic accountant studying exactly how dirty money moves, where it hides, and whose fingerprints it leaves behind when it travels. She knew the mechanics of corruption the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not with disgust, but with clinical, dangerous precision. That knowledge had almost cost her everything. In many ways, it already had. She stood on the raised platform at the far end of the Foundry, wrists bound in front of her with a thin cable tie, the kind that costs 40 cents and holds like iron. Her dress was not hers. Her shoes were not hers. Nothing about her circumstances tonight had been chosen by her, and every cell in her body was aware of that fact. But her eyes were steady. Her breathing was controlled, measured, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way her college track coach had taught her before races she was terrified of losing. She had won most of those races. She planned to win this one too. Her gaze moved across the room slowly, methodically, not with panic, but with the quiet, focused intensity of someone reading a room the way others read a page. She cataloged exits. She cataloged postures. She cataloged which buyers leaned forward with hunger and which ones leaned back with patience, because patience in a room like this meant power. The hungry ones were loud. The patient ones were lethal. Then she found him. He sat toward the back, slightly apart from the others, the way a period sits at the end of a sentence, final, unhurried, and completely in charge of everything that came before it. He was not leaning forward. He was not watching the platform with the restless appetite the others could not quite hide. He sat with his hands rested on the arms of the chair, still in a way that suggested stillness was not an accident but a discipline. His dark suit was the kind that does not draw attention to itself, because it does not need to. His eyes, even from across the room, carried the quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to raise his voice to be obeyed. Luca Morti. Ava knew the name the same way most people in certain professional circles knew it, cautiously, and from a careful distance. His name had appeared in the financial records she had reviewed during the federal fraud investigation that had eventually been turned against her. Not prominently, not in a way that would have meant anything to someone who did not know how to read between the lines of a balance sheet, but she had known. Luca Morti's legitimate shipping and import enterprises were threaded, quietly and deliberately, through the same financial architecture that Senator Richard Halbrook had spent 7 years constructing. They were not partners in any obvious sense. But the money had moved through corridors they both controlled, and in forensic accounting, that is never a coincidence. She had noted it, she had flagged it, and then the world had collapsed on top of her before she could do anything about it. The auctioneer's voice cut through the low murmur of the room, smooth, professional, grotesquely ordinary. The gavel was in his hand. The buyer from the cartel representatives' row had already submitted a figure. Ava could feel it all closing in, the way a door closes when someone on the other side is leaning against it hard. She looked at Luca Morty one more time. He was still not bidding. He had not moved. He was watching, not her specifically, but everything, the way a man watches a situation he has already decided to understand before he decides whether to care about it. And in that stillness, Ava saw the only equation in the room that still had a variable she could affect. She stepped off the platform. The sound that moved through the room was not a gasp so much as a collective failure of composure. 40 powerful men momentarily unable to process what they were watching. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. 2 security guards took half a step forward and then stopped, because nobody had given them a clear instruction, and men in that profession do not improvise well. Ava walked across the foundry floor in shoes that were not hers, toward a man who frightened entire cities, with cable-tied wrists and a heartbeat she could feel in her throat. She did not stop. She could not afford to stop, because the moment she paused, the calculation would collapse and she would have nothing left but the terror she had been holding at bay with everything she had. She reached him. She gripped the lapel of his jacket with both bound hands, not desperately, but with a grip that said she had made a decision and intended to stand behind it. She leaned in close enough that only he could hear her. Her voice was low. It was controlled. But beneath the control, anyone paying attention would have heard something that was not quite steadiness. It was the sound of a woman holding steadiness together with both hands while it tried to come apart. "Kiss me now," she said, "and damn the consequences." For the first time that night, for what people in that room would later describe, in the rare moments they dared to speak of it at all, as the most unexpected thing they had ever witnessed. Stay with this story, because what happens in the next 60 seconds does not just save Ava Carter's life. It starts a war that will reach all the way to the state's Senate. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments, and hit that like button if this story already has its grip on you. Let's get back to the story. Nobody in that room moved first. That was the thing about power, real power, not the kind that announces itself with noise and muscle, but the kind that has spent years making itself impossible to read. Real power creates a pause. It creates that specific, airless moment where everyone in a room simultaneously decides to wait and see what the most dangerous person present is going to do next. Luca Morty did not kiss her back immediately. He looked at her first. Not with surprise. Surprise was an emotion that required a person to have expectations, and Luca Morty had long since stopped expecting the world to behave in predictable ways. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just rearranged itself in front of him and demands to be reconsidered. His eyes moved across her face with the focused economy of someone reading a document rather than looking at a person. Searching for the thing beneath the thing, the calculation behind the gesture, the architecture of a mind that had just done something that most people in this room would never have the nerve or the intelligence to attempt. He found what he was looking for in about 3 seconds. Then he kissed her. It was not a romantic kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that belongs in a story about 2 people falling toward each other. It was a declaration, delivered with the same cold deliberateness with which a general plants a flag, not because the ground is beautiful, but because planting the flag is the entire point. His hand came up and rested at the side of her jaw, steady, unhurried, and the message it sent to every man in that room arrived faster and more clearly than any words could have carried it. She is claimed. The room detonated. Not with violence, not yet, but with the specific chaos of 40 powerful men realizing simultaneously that something had just happened which none of them had accounted for, and all of them would need to respond to. Voices cracked through the low hum of the space. The cartel representative's chair scraped back hard against the concrete floor. The auctioneer, who had navigated dozens of these evenings with the practiced calm of someone who understood that composure was the most expensive thing in the room, lost his entirely and said something sharp and urgent into the earpiece clipped beneath his collar. The two security guards who had frozen earlier made their decision at last and began moving toward the platform. They were too late. They were always going to be too late. Because the moment Luca had kissed her, 4 things had happened in the room that nobody except his men had noticed. A tall figure near the east corridor shifted his jacket and rested a hand against his side in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. 2 men seated near the back row stood at almost the same instant, not rushing, just standing, with the deliberate ease of people who had already mapped every exit and were simply positioning themselves accordingly. And the 4th man, the one who had been stationed near the service entrance the entire evening posing as venue staff, turned and said something quietly into a radio. This was not a rescue. Luca Morty did not do rescues. What he did was extractions, clean, controlled, and conducted with the kind of sequenced precision that only looks effortless because of how much preparation lives underneath it. His men had not scrambled. They had activated, and there is a significant difference between the two. Luca stood. He did not pull Ava behind him. He moved beside her, one hand at the small of her back, steering rather than dragging, and the touch carried the same message the kiss had carried. This is not protection. This is possession, and possession has terms. "Walk," he said against her ear, and his voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Ava walked. The room was fracturing around them now in the organized way that expensive chaos fractures, loud at the edges, purposeful at the center. The cartel representative had risen from his seat and was gesturing sharply at 2 men flanking the aisle, his voice cutting through the noise in rapid, clipped Spanish. The auctioneer was speaking urgently into his collar again. Several other buyers had risen from their chairs, not out of aggression, but out of the instinct of men who have learned that, when the room changes temperature, you get to your feet and find out which way the wind is blowing before you decide what to do about it. Luca's men cleared the path before he and Ava reached it. Not theatrically, there was no display of force, no drawn weapons, nothing that would give the room a reason to escalate beyond the point that was manageable. Just bodies, repositioned with quiet authority, and the kind of eye contact that communicated clearly enough that further conversation would be unproductive. They moved through the service corridor, down a passage that smelled of old concrete and cold air, and up through a steel door that opened into a loading dock where 2 black vehicles sat running. Ava noticed that the engines were already warm. They had been waiting. She filed that detail away the way she filed everything, carefully and without comment. One of Luca's men opened the rear door of the first vehicle. Luca guided her in with the same measured, territorial calm he had maintained from the moment she had gripped his collar on that floor. He followed her in and pulled the door shut, and the vehicle moved before the latch had fully caught. Behind them, the foundry was still burning, not with fire, but with the particular fury of powerful men who had just been outmaneuvered by someone they had not noticed watching them carefully enough. Luca turned and looked at Ava in the low dark of the moving vehicle. "Now," he said, "you are going to tell me exactly who you are." It was not a question. The penthouse sat on the 53rd floor of a building that did not appear in any real estate listing under Luca Morty's name. That was intentional, of course. Everything about Luca Morty was intentional. The building registered under a shell company, the elevator that required a key card and a biometric confirmation to reach the top floor, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of Chicago's skyline in every direction while ensuring that nobody outside could see in. The city stretched below like a circuit board lit from within, all amber and white and cold blue, beautiful in the way that things built on top of other things tend to be beautiful impressively, and without apology. Ava stood at the edge of those windows and looked out at it for exactly as long as it took her legs to stop threatening to give way beneath her. Then she turned around. The penthouse was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly what she had expected. It was not ostentatious. There was no gold trim, no excessive square footage filled with furniture chosen to intimidate. It was precise, clean lines, dark materials, a space that had been designed with the same philosophy its owner seemed to apply to everything else. Nothing unnecessary, nothing that did not serve a purpose. The kind of interior that communicated, quietly and without effort, that the person who lived here had long since moved past needing to impress anyone. Luca stood near the center of the room with his jacket removed, his sleeves pushed to the forearm, and a glass of water, not whiskey, not anything theatrical, in his right hand. He was watching her with the same measured attention he had given her in the vehicle, in the foundry, in every moment since she had walked across that floor and changed the terms of her own fate. Two of his men stood near the corridor entrance. They were not hovering, they were simply present, in the way that serious men are present in spaces where serious things are being decided. Lucas set the glass down on the table beside him. "Sit," he said. Ava sat, not because she was told to, but because her body made the executive decision before her pride could intervene, and she had learned a long time ago that there was no useful distinction between a strategic retreat and a necessary one. Luca pulled a chair from the opposite side of the low table and sat across from her. He did not lean forward. He did not cross his arms or set his jaw or perform any of the dominance postures that men in his position often relied upon. He simply sat, with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that the room was already his and had nothing left to prove about it. "You chose me specifically," he said. It was not phrased as an accusation, and it was not phrased as a compliment. It was phrased as a fact that he had already confirmed and was now simply choosing to surface. "In a room full of buyers, you walked past every other option and came straight to me. That was not panic." He paused for exactly one beat. "Panic doesn't walk in a straight line." Ava held his gaze. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." "So you knew who I was." "I knew who you were." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not warmth, not suspicion, but the particular quality of attention that sharpens when a person realizes the conversation they are in is more interesting than the one they had prepared for. "Then you also knew," he said, "that walking toward me was not the safer choice. It was simply a different kind of dangerous." "I'm a forensic accountant," Ava said. "I don't look for safe. I look for the option with the most leverage." Luca was quiet for a moment. The city hummed 43 floors below them, indifferent and enormous. One of his men near the corridor shifted his weight and said nothing. "Here is what I know," Luca said at last, and his voice settled into something lower, more deliberate, the register of a man moving from observation into terms. "Someone with considerable reach wanted you processed through that auction tonight rather than handled quietly. That means you are not simply inconvenient to someone. You are specifically dangerous to someone. And dangerous people do not become less dangerous because you put them in a room and feed them." He looked at her steadily. "They become problems." "And you don't keep problems," Ava said. "I don't keep problems," he confirmed. "I resolve them or I acquire them. The distinction depends entirely on whether the problem is worth more solved or working." Ava understood the sentence completely. She understood it the way you understand something that has been constructed with great care to mean exactly what it says and nothing softer. "You have 24 hours, Luca said. "Not to explain yourself, I have people for that, and they will find out what I need to know regardless. What you have 24 hours to do is show me that what is inside your head is worth the war I just declared by walking you out of that building." He stood, unhurried, and straightened the cuff of his shirt with two small, economical movements. "Every man in that room tonight has a connection to someone. The man who put you on that platform has a connection to someone. I need to know whether you are an asset or a liability before any of those connections start making phone calls." He looked at her one final time. "So I suggest you stop recovering and start thinking." He walked toward the corridor, without waiting for her response. Ava looked back at the city through the glass. 53 floors of steel and altitude between her and the ground, in the home of a man who had just given her a deadline instead of a cell. She had been in worse positions. She pulled the cable tie apart with a sharp, practiced motion against the table's edge, something she had worked out quietly in the vehicle on the way over, and set the two pieces down on the table in front of her. Then she started thinking. They gave her a laptop, which told her more about Luca Morty than anything he had said directly. Not because the gesture was generous, it wasn't, particularly, but because the machine they brought her was clean in a way that only deliberate people achieve. No saved passwords, no browsing history, no residual documents sitting in a recycling bin waiting to be recovered by someone who knew where to look. Whoever had prepared it understood that information is a currency, and you do not hand currency to a stranger without counting it first. The laptop was an offer, but it was a bounded one. Here is a tool, it said. Let us see what you build with it. Ava built plenty. They had also given her access, limited, structured access, to Luca's declared financial portfolio. The legitimate side of his empire, the part that existed in filing cabinets and audited records, and the kind of corporate documentation that survives scrutiny because it is designed to. 3 shipping companies operating across the Great Lakes corridor. A commercial real estate holdings firm based in Illinois. 2 import and distribution businesses with federal licensing, so clean it practically gleamed. And a private investment fund, registered in Delaware in the way that most private investment funds of a certain size are registered in Delaware. Quietly, efficiently, and with the minimum possible invitation for follow-up questions. On the surface, it was exactly what a very successful, very careful man's financial life was supposed to look like. Ava had spent 4 years learning that surfaces are where the performance lives. The truth lives in the margins. She started with the shipping companies because she always started where the physical movement was. Money is abstract. It can be restructured, redirected, relabeled with creative accounting and the right legal counsel. But physical goods have to move through real ports, real manifests, real customs declarations, and real timestamps. And timestamps, in Ava's professional experience, were the most honest things in any financial record. Because nobody thinks to lie about the exact time a container was cleared through a checkpoint at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in February. She cross-referenced shipping volumes against declared revenue. She mapped the movement dates against publicly available Port Authority records, pulling what she could access through federal trade databases that her credentials, suspended, but not yet formally revoked, still gave her a thread of access to. She built a timeline on the screen in front of her using nothing more than column headers and date sorting, the forensic accountant's equivalent of laying bones out on a table to see what shape they make. By the 3rd hour, she had found the first inconsistency. It was small, the kind of small that is designed to be small, a marginal gap between declared cargo values and the corresponding insurance premiums on 3 separate shipments across an 18-month window. Small enough that a standard audit would weight it as rounding variance and move on. But Ava did not move on because she had seen this specific pattern before. She had seen it in the documentation she had reviewed during the federal investigation. She had seen it in the financial architecture that Senator Richard Halbrook had spent 7 years quietly assembling beneath the surface of his public career. She stopped typing. Not dramatically. Her hand simply came to rest on the edge of the keyboard and stayed there, and for a moment she did not move at all. The kind of stillness that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with a mind that has just arrived somewhere it was not entirely prepared to be, even though it had been walking in that direction the whole time. She had suspected this connection existed. She had built her entire gamble tonight on the possibility that it did. But suspicion and evidence are 2 very different things, and the distance between them, the moment of crossing from one to the other, has a weight to it that does not get lighter just because you were expecting it. She exhaled slowly, 4 counts out the way she had been trained. She pressed her thumb into her palm hard enough to feel it, a small, private anchor, and then she pulled up the investment fund. The Delaware registration was immaculate, as expected. But the fund had 11 limited partners, listed by entity name rather than personal name in the way that limited partnerships are legally permitted to structure themselves. 9 of those entities were traceable through public business filings within 4 searches. The 10th took her 40 minutes and 3 redirect trails through 2 separate state registries before she arrived at a holding company whose registered agent address appeared, after one more search, in a campaign finance disclosure from 4 years ago. It was listed as the operational address for a political action committee that had donated significantly to the Senate re-election campaign of Richard Halbrook of Illinois. Ava stared at the screen. The city outside the windows had shifted deeper into the night, the skyline burning the same quiet amber and cold blue it had been burning when she arrived, indifferent to the fact that everything she was looking at was rearranging itself into something she would not be able to unknow. She had known there was a connection. She had flagged it in her original investigation as a thread worth pulling, not conclusive, not yet, but present. What she had not known, what the records she was looking at now, were beginning to suggest with the quiet insistence of evidence that has been waiting patiently to be found, was that the connection was not incidental. It was structural. Luca Morti's financial network and Richard Halbrook's hidden architecture were not 2 separate systems that occasionally touched. They were 2 load-bearing walls in the same building. Which meant that Luca did not just have proximity to the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. He was part of what held it upright. She felt it then, the thing she had been holding at bay since the moment she had stepped off that platform. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular vertigo of realizing that the gamble you made to survive tonight may have placed you at the center of something far larger and far more dangerous than the thing you were originally running from. Her chest tightened in a way she did not have the luxury of acknowledging for long. She pressed her thumb into her palm one more time, held it, and let the feeling pass through her rather than settling in. Then the door opened. Luca Morti crossed the room and stopped a few feet from the desk, looking at the screen. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved across the open documents with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at, which told her that whatever else Luca was, he was not a man who had handed the details of his own empire to other people and stopped paying attention. "You have been at this for 4 hours," he said. "I'm thorough," Ava replied. He looked at the shipping manifest comparison open on the left side of the screen, then at the investment fund registration on the right. A long, considered silence followed, the kind that is not empty but full of something being weighed carefully before it is spoken. "You didn't choose me because I was the most dangerous man in that room," he said finally. His voice was even, but beneath the evenness was something that might have been the earliest stage of a realization arriving somewhere it had not expected to land. "You chose me because you already knew my name before tonight." Ava turned in the chair and looked at him directly. "I knew your name 18 months ago," she said. "I found it in a set of financial records that someone very powerful spent considerable energy making sure nobody would ever read." She held his gaze without flinching. "The same person who had me put on that platform tonight." Luca was very still. "Show me," he said. Luca had been studying the documents for 11 minutes when the lights went out. Not all of them, just the perimeter lighting, the external grid that ringed the building's upper floors and the rooftop infrastructure. The penthouse interior stayed lit, which meant it was not a power failure. A power failure takes everything at once, indiscriminately, the way most accidents do. This was selective, surgical, and selective darkness at 2 in the morning, following an extraction from an underground auction that had not gone according to anyone's plan, meant exactly one thing. Luca was already moving before the first of his men spoke into the room. "We have entry teams on floors 49 and 51, the man near the corridor said, his voice carrying the flat, stripped-down calm of someone delivering information rather than processing it. "Stairwells east and west. Elevator shafts are being held at lobby level. Someone cut the call mechanism from outside." Luca did not look at Ava. He was already at the panel beside the bookcase on the far wall, pressing a sequence into the keypad there, with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a task they have rehearsed enough times that the body handles it while the mind moves ahead to the next problem. "How many?" he said. "Minimum 8, possibly 12. The bookcase moved. It did not swing dramatically. It slid, on a recess track, smooth and nearly silent, revealing a corridor barely wide enough for two people walking closely together. The space beyond it was not a room in any comfortable sense of the word. It was reinforced, poured concrete walls, a steel door at the far end, a ventilation system that hummed at low frequency, and enough ambient lighting to see by without providing anything that could be called warmth. A panic room, though that particular label had always struck Ava as a strange one, because the room itself did not panic. That was left entirely to the people inside it. "In," Luca said, and this time it was directed at her. Ava went in. He followed. The bookcase slid back into place behind them with a sound like a sentence being closed. Through the small monitor mounted to the left of the steel door, fed by cameras positioned across the penthouse and the 2 floors below it, Ava could see figures moving through the space she had been sitting in 4 minutes ago. They were dressed in tactical configuration, dark clothing, earpieces, the kind of coordinated movement that does not come from improvisation, but from a briefing conducted somewhere earlier that evening. Someone had planned this. Someone had known where Luca was, had known about the extraction from the foundry, and had mobilized a response team fast enough to be on the building within hours. Only a very specific kind of person could do that. Ava's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the elevator. She turned away from the monitor and pressed her back against the concrete wall. She told herself it was to give Luca space to communicate with his men through the earpiece he had clipped in during the first 30 seconds. She told herself it was tactical, positional, sensible. She told herself a number of things in rapid succession that were all technically true, and none of which were the actual reason her hands had begun to shake. She pressed them flat against her thighs and focused on breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The concrete was cold through her dress, and she concentrated on that, the specific physical fact of the temperature, the way you grip something solid when the ground is moving. It didn't work as well as it usually did. Because the thing she had been managing successfully since the platform, since the vehicle, since the penthouse and the laptop and the documents and every controlled, forward-moving moment of the last several hours, was beginning to come loose at the edges. The fear she had compressed into something small and manageable and filed away beneath the calculation and the urgency. It was pushing back now, in the dark and the concrete and the confined air of a room that was safe only in the structural sense of the word. Her breath started to shorten. Her chest tightened with a pressure that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. The shaking in her hands moved upward into her forearms, and she pressed harder against her thighs, and it did not stop. She was not falling apart. She was too disciplined for that, too practiced in the architecture of self-control. But she was, for the first time since the foundry, visibly afraid, and she could not make it stop. She did not hear Luca finish his communication. She only became aware that he had stopped talking when she registered the quality of the silence change, the absence of his voice where his voice had been, and looked up to find him watching her. He was not watching her the way he had watched her in the penthouse, or in the vehicle, or across the foundry floor. He was not reading her the way you read a document or assess a variable. He was watching her the way you watch something you were not expecting to see, and the expression on his face was not pity, and it was not calculation. It was something considerably more uncomfortable than either of those things. It was recognition. He crossed the small space between them and crouched down so that he was at her eye level, a gesture that, from a man of his particular architecture of authority, cost something. He did not touch her. He did not offer the kind of words that people offer in these moments because they cannot bear the silence. He simply stayed there, level with her, present in the way that requires nothing from the other person except the acknowledgement that they are not alone in the room. Ava's breathing steadied. Slowly, unevenly at first, and then with more regularity, the way a disrupted rhythm finds its way back to itself, not through force, but through something being held steady beside it. She looked at him. He looked back. "I know," he said quietly. Just that. 2 words that did not explain anything or resolve anything or pretend that the situation on the other side of the concrete wall was anything other than what it was. But they landed with a weight that surprised her, because they were not sympathy. They were acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, she was realizing from a man who gave nothing away, was its own significant thing. On the monitor behind him, Luca's men were moving through the penthouse floors with the controlled aggression of people who had been given very clear instructions about what the evening required. The entry team was being compressed, redirected, systematically outmaneuvered in the dark by people who knew the building better than they did and had prepared for exactly this contingency. The raid was being handled. But something else was happening in the panic room that could not be handled in the same way, something quieter and considerably more difficult, because it had no protocol and no rehearsal and no clear strategic outcome. For the first time since she had walked across the foundry floor and changed the terms of her own survival, Ava Carter had let someone see behind the calculation. And Luca, Morty had not looked away. The estate sat 12 miles outside of Hammond, Indiana, behind a tree line so deliberately maintained it looked natural to anyone who did not know that nature, left to itself, does not grow in straight lines. Ava knew because she had studied the satellite imagery for 2 hours on the drive out, cross-referencing the property against the land registry records she had pulled the night before while Luca's men swept the penthouse, and confirmed what the monitor had already told them. The entry team had been neutralized, the building secured, and whoever had sent them was now aware that the operation had failed. That last part mattered more than the first two. A failed operation does not end an objective. It accelerates one. Which meant the window for retrieving the ledger from the estate had gone from narrow to critical somewhere between Hammond city limits and the gravel road Luca's driver had cut the headlights on 4 minutes ago. The encrypted financial ledger was the only copy of the original documentation Ava had compiled before the senator's people had moved against her. 18 months of forensic work, transaction records, shell company maps, time-stamped fund movements, and the specific thread that connected Halbrook's political architecture to the financial channels running through Luca's empire. She had encrypted it, fragmented it across 3 separate files, and stored it in a location that was not a cloud server or a bank vault or anywhere that a person with federal resources could find through conventional means. She had stored it inside the property management system of a private estate that the senator himself had facilitated the acquisition of for a donor on paper, but for a very specific operational purpose in practice. She had put it there because the safest place to hide something from a man is inside a house he thinks he controls. Luca had listened to the full explanation in the vehicle without interrupting once, which told her his opinion of the plan before he expressed it. "That is either the most intelligent thing I have heard in a considerable time," he had said when she finished, "or the most reckless." He had paused for exactly 1 beat. "I have not yet decided which." "Both things can be true," Ava had said. He had almost smiled, almost. They went in on foot from the tree line's eastern edge, Luca, Ava, and 2 of his men whose names she had been given as Marco and Cal, and who moved through the dark with the unhurried efficiency of people for whom night operations were not an exceptional circumstance, but a professional one. The perimeter had 2 cameras on the eastern face and a motion-sensitive flood system covering the main approach from the gate. Ava had mapped both during the drive. Marco had handled the camera loop feed from the vehicle before they stepped out, a 12-second cycling override that bought them a window and nothing more. 12 seconds, in Ava's experience, is either plenty of time or no time at all, depending entirely on whether you have planned what to do with it. They had planned. She moved when Luca moved, which was something she noticed without having decided to make it a habit. In the panic room, in the hours that followed the raid, something had recalibrated between them in a way that neither had addressed directly and both were clearly aware of. He had seen the fear she hid. She had let him. And now, crossing a frost-hardened lawn in the Indiana dark toward a fortified estate belonging to a senator who wanted her gone from the world entirely, she found that she was reading his movements the way she read financial documents, not reactively, but ahead of time, anticipating the next line before it arrived because she had begun to understand the pattern of how he thought. He found the service entrance on the first pass. She had told him it would be on the north face, set back from the exterior lighting grid, and it was exactly where she said it would be because estates built for concealment rather than comfort follow specific architectural logic that she had seen enough times to recognize. Cal handled the lock in under 40 seconds. The four of them moved inside. The property management terminal was on the second floor, in a room that had been configured as a private office. Dark wood, closed blinds, the kind of deliberate neutrality that suggests a space used for meetings its participants would prefer not to have witnessed. Ava sat at the terminal and pulled up the system with the access credentials she had memorized rather than written down, because writing things down when someone is trying to erase you is the kind of optimism she could not afford. The files were there. All 3 fragments, exactly where she had placed them 14 months ago, sitting inside the property's irrigation scheduling system, disguised as maintenance logs for the East Garden's water pressure calibration. She had always appreciated the irony of that, the evidence that could dismantle a senator's empire, filed under horticulture. She pulled the fragments, compiled them onto the encrypted drive Cal pressed into her hand without being asked, and was done in under 4 minutes. She stood and looked at Luca, who had been positioned at the door the entire time, watching the corridor with the patient, contained alertness of a man who has learned that the most dangerous moment of any operation is the one just before you believe it has succeeded. "Done," she said quietly. He nodded once and they moved. Out through the service entrance, back across the lawn, through the tree line and into the vehicle in a sequence so clean and uninterrupted that it felt, for a disorienting moment, less like an infiltration and more like a conversation. 2 people finishing each other's sentences without needing to check whether the other was keeping up. Force and precision, moving as a single current rather than 2 separate ones. In the vehicle, with the estate receding behind them and the encrypted drive in her hand, Ava allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief. Then she thought about the senator, and the relief dissolved. Because a man who had built what Richard Halbrook had built did not send one team to one building and consider the matter closed. He sent the first team to confirm the target's location, and everything that followed was designed around what the first team reported back. She looked at Luca. He was already looking at her. "He knows where we went tonight," she said. Luca's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Yes," he said, "he does." The safe house was in Wisconsin, 2 hours north of the state line, down a county road that became a dirt road that became a suggestion of a path through dense pine that only resolved into something navigable if you already knew it was there. Someone had known it was there for a long time. The cabin was not rough. It was sparse in the way that deliberate preparation looks sparse, the way a room looks when someone has removed everything that does not serve a function and left everything that does. A generator. A wood stove that had been used recently enough that the ash was still warm. A kitchen with provisions that had not expired. 2 rooms separated by a wall and a door that closed properly. Luca's network, Ava had come to understand, was not just financial and not just physical. It was geographic, a distributed infrastructure of places where a person could disappear from sight without disappearing from operation. She set the encrypted drive on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down on the wooden chair beside the stove and did not move for a while. The drive in front of her meant nothing on its own. It was a tool, an object, a few grams of hardware. What it carried was 18 months of her life. 18 months of work conducted under the growing and eventually confirmed suspicion that the people above her in the investigation were not oversight, they were interference. 18 months of building something that had then been taken from her and turned around and used as the instrument of her own destruction. The senator had not just framed her. He had used her intelligence against her, which was the more personal injury of the 2, and one she had not allowed herself to sit with until right now, in a pine cabin in Wisconsin, with no immediate threat requiring her attention and nothing left to calculate. She was tired in a way that sleep does not fix. Luca came in from the outer room and stopped when he saw her. He had removed his jacket somewhere along the way and rolled his sleeves back, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him across the floor of the foundry, like a man rather than a position. He read the room the way he always read everything, quickly, accurately, and without announcing what he had concluded. He crossed to the stove and added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside it. He did not ask if she was all right. She appreciated that more than she could have explained to anyone who had not spent the last several hours watching him communicate exclusively in actions rather than reassurances. "The senator will have the Wisconsin properties flagged within 48 hours, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, and then immediately tired of being proud of it, because the performance of steadiness was exhausting in a way that the actual emotion beneath it was not. 36, Luca said, crouching beside the stove. I would not give him 48. He closed the stove door and stood. We move at first light. And the drive. The drive goes where you go. He looked at her directly. You are the only person who knows how to read what is on it in a way that holds up. The evidence without the analyst is a document. You make it a case. She looked at him for a moment. You have spent 3 days deciding whether I am an asset or a liability. I have, he said. He did not pretend otherwise, which she had noticed was a consistent quality of his. He did not soften conclusions retroactively. He stood by what he had thought and said so, and revised openly when revision was warranted. It was, unexpectedly, one of the more trustworthy things about him. And, she said. He held her gaze. You already know the answer. You have known it since Indiana. She had. That was the thing about being honest with herself. It removed the comfort of uncertainty. She had known since the estate, since moving through that operation as a single current, since the moment she had looked up from the terminal and found him already watching the corridor ahead of her, that the question of asset or liability had resolved itself, and something more complicated had moved into the space it left behind. She stood. She was not entirely sure why she stood. It was not calculated. That was the part that unsettled her, the absence of calculation, the way the action arrived before the reasoning did. She stood, and the distance between them in that small room was not very much distance at all, and she looked at him in the firelight from the stove's grate and felt the full accumulated weight of the last 72 hours settle across her shoulders all at once. The platform, the vehicle, the penthouse. The panic room and the dark, and his voice saying simply, I know. Indiana and the drive and the Pine Road and this room. Luca did not move toward her. He was not a man who moved toward things he had not decided to move toward, and the decision when it came was not impulsive, but it was not cold either. It was the kind of decision that has been forming at a level below conscious thought for long enough that, when it finally surfaces, it arrives not as a choice, but as an acknowledgement of something that has already happened. He reached up and rested his hand against the side of her face, the same way he had in the foundry, but nothing else about it was the same. In the foundry, it had been a declaration for a room. This was not for a room. This was not for anyone or anything outside the two of them, and the wood stove and the Wisconsin dark pressing against the cabin windows. When she kissed him this time, there was no strategy in it. That was what broke her open more than anything else. Not the kiss itself, but the absence of architecture behind it. No calculation, no leverage, no angle being played. Just two people who had been running on controlled purpose for so long that the moment control released, it released completely, like a cable that has been wound too tightly for too long and finally, in a quiet room with no audience, gives way. Neither of them were in control of what followed. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, Ava Carter did not try to be. The first light came in gray and flat through the cabin windows, the kind of Wisconsin morning that does not ease you into itself, but arrives all at once, cold and definitive. Ava was already awake when it did. She had not slept much, an hour, perhaps 2, in the way that people sleep when their minds have not agreed to the arrangement. She lay still in the low dark of the second room and listened to the pine trees move outside and thought about the drive on the table and the 48 hours Luca had revised down to 36 and the road they would need to take before either number expired. She thought about Cal. She had been thinking about Cal since Indiana, in the background of everything else. A quiet, persistent frequency she had not been able to fully tune out. It was not a single thing. It was the accumulation of small things, the kind that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything to someone trained to read the distance between what a record shows and what actually happened. Cal had handled the lock at the estate service entrance in under 40 seconds, which was fast. Professionally fast. The kind of fast that comes from familiarity rather than skill alone. The kind of fast that suggests a person has touched a mechanism before. Not that specific mechanism, perhaps, but that specific type, in that specific context, under conditions that were supposed to be novel. She had noted it and said nothing, because a suspicion without evidence is not a conclusion. It is a liability if acted upon prematurely, and a warning if held carefully until the picture fills in. The picture had been filling in quietly ever since. She rose before Luca and went to the outer room and found the drive where she had left it on the table. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers and was still holding it when she heard the vehicle. Not Luca's vehicle. His was parked at the rear of the cabin, and she had heard it arrive last night and knew its engine note the way you know the sounds of a space you have been paying close attention to. This was a different engine, heavier, approaching on the dirt road from the east with the deliberate pace of something that already knew where it was going. She moved to the window and looked out and saw two things at the same time. The first was the black SUV coming through the pines with its headlights off, which was not the behavior of something that had found this location by accident or by conventional pursuit. You do not cut your headlights on an approach unless you already know the target is there and you do not want to announce the final distance. Someone had given them the location. Someone who had it. The second thing she saw was Cal, standing at the edge of the tree line to the north, not moving, not raising an alarm, watching the SUV arrive with his hands loose at his sides and his posture carrying the particular stillness of a man who is waiting for something he arranged. Ava's chest went cold. She turned from the window and crossed the room in 4 steps and pushed the door to Luca's room open without knocking. "We have a problem," she said, and her voice had the quality it got when the situation had moved past the point where volume was relevant. "Cal, and we have 30 seconds. Luca was on his feet before she finished the sentence. What followed was not 30 seconds of successful action. That is not how betrayal works, and Ava knew it even as she moved. Betrayal does not give you 30 seconds. It gives you the illusion of 30 seconds and then takes the first 15 while you are still processing what you lost. Luca reached the outer room and got the door open, and Marco was already coming around the side of the cabin from the south, which told them the perimeter was set before the vehicle had even reached the clearing, which meant the timeline of the arrangement was longer than the last 12 hours. Cal had been positioned before Indiana. Luca said Marco's name once, sharply, in the tone of a man confirming a loyalty he needed confirmed immediately. Marco moved to his left without hesitation, which answered that question. But the men coming out of the SUV were 4, and they were already across the clearing, and the variable that none of them had in their favor was the one that almost always decides these things before strategy can intervene. Time. They took Ava from behind, 2 of them, with the efficient coordination of people who had been briefed specifically on her rather than on the situation generally. They did not reach for Luca. They did not engage Marco. They came directly and exclusively for her, which told her in the single clear second before her vision compressed from the pressure at the back of her neck that this had never been about stopping them. It was about separating them. The drive was in her jacket pocket. She felt one of them find it before the darkness fully took her, a hand moving with practiced efficiency to the exact location. A person would store something small and critical, which meant Cal had known she had it and had told someone where she would keep it, and that specific detail, the intimacy of it, the granularity of the intelligence, hit her harder than the physical force did. She did not lose consciousness entirely. She held on to the edge of it the way you hold the edge of a table when the floor tilts, aware of Luca's voice somewhere behind her, controlled and lethal and too far away, and the sound of a door closing, and then motion, the cabin receding, the pines closing in on both sides of the vehicle. No hood. No restraints beyond the hands holding her in the seat. No demand. No phone handed to her to deliver a message to Luca. Nothing that resembled negotiation or leverage or the transactional brutality of a kidnapping conducted for the purpose of exchange. Just movement. Distance, separation. She understood then, with the cold and clarifying precision that fear sometimes produces in a mind trained to function beneath it, that this was not leverage. Leverage requires the other party to be offered a choice. This was not an offer. This was a statement, delivered not in words, but in the oldest available language, the language of removal. Senator Richard Halbrook did not want Ava Carter across a negotiating table from him. He wanted her gone from the conversation entirely. And the message was not for her. It was for Luca. Luca found Cal in 12 minutes. Not because Cal was easy to find, he wasn't, and under different circumstances, the route he had taken from the cabin through the pine corridor and down toward the county road would have been sufficient to put meaningful distance between himself and the consequences of what he had done. But Cal had made the mistake that most people make when they believe the worst is already behind them. He had slowed down. And Luca Morty, in the 12 minutes since the SUV had taken Ava down the dirt road, had not slowed down once. The conversation with Cal was brief and produced two things. The first was a location, a private shipping facility on the Lake Michigan waterfront, 40 minutes south, registered to a logistics company that Ava would have identified in approximately 4 minutes as a shell entity connected to Halbrook's operational network. The second thing the conversation produced was the confirmation Luca had already arrived at independently, but needed stated aloud before he could act on it with the full weight of his resources. This was never going to end in a room with lawyers. He made 3 calls from the vehicle on the way to the lake. The first was to Marco, who was already moving. The second was to a number that did not appear in any contact list on any device Luca owned, because the people you call in the final phase of a serious problem are not people you keep in your phone. The third call was the one that would matter most before the night was finished, not to a soldier or a strategist, but to a journalist. A specific journalist, based in Washington, who had been sitting on a story about Senate financial corruption for 14 months without enough source documentation to publish it safely. Luca left her a message. He told her to be ready. He told her the documentation was coming. He did not tell her from where, because that detail was still 40 minutes and one waterfront confrontation from being resolved. The Lake Michigan facility was not designed to look like what it was. From the road, it presented as a functional, if unremarkable, commercial dock loading infrastructure, a warehouse block, perimeter fencing of the standard industrial variety. But the fencing had been upgraded within the last 18 months, and the lighting grid was motion responsive in a configuration that served surveillance more than safety. And the 2 men at the gate were carrying weapons beneath jackets that were one size too large in the specific way that concealed carry produces when the person is not particularly concerned about concealment. Ava was inside the warehouse. She knew this because she had been conscious for the last 20 minutes of the drive and had spent those 20 minutes doing the thing she always did when the situation removed every other tool available to her. She had paid attention. She had noted the turns, the gradient changes, the sound of the road surface shifting from asphalt to the coarser texture of a waterfront service road. She had noted the smell of the lake coming in through the vehicle's ventilation, cold, mineral, the specific scent of deep water in early morning. She had noted the number of steps from the vehicle to the building and the acoustic quality of the space she was walked into, which told her the ceiling was high and the floor was concrete and the building was larger than its external profile suggested. And she had noted the laptop on the table. They had put her in a chair in a partitioned section of the warehouse, not a cell, not a formal detention space, but a deliberately configured area with a table, a chair, a laptop, and a camera mounted in the corner whose indicator light was green. Senator Richard Halbrook was not present in the room. He was, she understood, watching from somewhere that was not this building, which was consistent with everything she knew about how he operated. Richard Halbrook had spent his entire career engineering outcomes from positions where his fingerprints could not be directly confirmed on anything. The laptop was open to a document. The document was a confession. Her confession, pre-written, attributed to her, detailed and plausible and devastating, admitting to the financial fraud she had originally investigated and adding several elements she had never encountered because they had never happened. It was well constructed. She gave him that. Whoever had written it understood her professional vocabulary and had replicated her analytical writing style with enough accuracy to be convincing to someone who did not know her work from the inside. The implication was clear. Sign it, or the version of events it described becomes the permanent record. Ava looked at the document for a long moment. Then she pulled the laptop toward her and began to type. Not a signature, not a revision. She opened a browser and navigated to the Federal Financial Disclosure Database and began building the case the way she had always built cases, from the timestamps outward, from the physical movement of money through real infrastructure, from the 11 limited partners and the PAC donation and the shipping manifest gaps and the investment fund that connected Halbrook's political architecture to Luca's empire in a way that was now. With the additional records she had accessed from Luca's terminal 2 nights ago and committed to memory because she had known the drive was a vulnerability, fully documentable from memory alone. She did not need the drive. She had never needed the drive. The drive was what they had taken. The mind that had read everything on it was still in the room. She had been working for 19 minutes when the perimeter outside the warehouse changed its acoustic register. A shift in the ambient sound that she had learned over the last 4 days to associate with Luca's people arriving somewhere they had been told not to be. A sharp report from the gate. Voices, briefly, and then the kind of silence that follows a situation being resolved rather than escalating. Then, from the lakefront side of the building, something considerably less quiet. What Luca waged on the waterfront of Lake Michigan that morning was not a battle in the cinematic sense. It was not prolonged or theatrical. It was compressed, efficient, and conducted with the focused brutality of a man who had reduced the situation to its simplest possible terms. Halbrook's people had taken something that was his. That was the complete extent of the calculation. Everything that followed was implementation. Marco came through the warehouse's side entrance 4 minutes after the perimeter fell. He crossed the space without drama and positioned himself between Ava and the camera in the corner, which blocked the feed, and said nothing beyond, "We have the outside," because nothing beyond that was required. Ava kept typing. By the time Luca came through the main door, jacket gone, a cut along his left forearm that he was not acknowledging, his eyes moving across the space with the rapid, assessing quality of a man confirming a situation rather than discovering one. She had compiled and uploaded the complete documented case to 4 separate recipients. The Journalist in Washington, a federal whistleblower submission portal, an investigative desk at a Chicago publication that had been covering Senate finance irregularities for 2 years, and a private attorney whose practice specialized in prosecutorial misconduct and whose contact details Luca had given her on the second morning in the penthouse without explaining why, which she now understood was because he had been thinking several moves ahead of the conversation they were having at the time. She looked up from the screen. He looked at her across the warehouse floor, the cut on his arm, the controlled intensity still running at full current behind his eyes, the complete absence of relief in his expression because relief was not something he permitted himself until a situation was fully resolved and not 1 second before. "It's done," she said. He crossed the floor toward her. He looked at the laptop screen and read enough of what was on it to understand the architecture of what she had built and how she had built it, and she watched him understand it, the full scope, the documentation trail, the 4 recipients, the absence of the physical drive as the primary instrument. "You didn't need the ledger," he said. "I needed them to think I did," she replied. "Someone who is trying to retrieve a drive is not building a case from memory. It bought me time." Luca was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Ava saw something move through his expression that she had not seen there before, not admiration exactly, because admiration implies surprise, and she did not think Luca was entirely surprised, but something that carried the weight of a conclusion fully arrived at, a final assessment delivered from the inside of a very considered mind. Outside, Lake Michigan moved against the dock with the slow, indifferent rhythm of deep water that has been there longer than the city above it, and intends to remain long after whatever happens on its shoreline. This morning has been recorded, processed, and filed. The system that Richard Halbrook had built over 7 years had just been taken apart from both sides simultaneously. One side had used force. The other had used the truth. Together, they had been enough. Senator Richard Halbrook was arrested on a Tuesday morning, which struck Ava as appropriately undramatic. Not a Friday, when the news cycle softens into the weekend and stories lose momentum before they can fully land. Not a Monday, when the week is too new and too loud with competing noise. A Tuesday, unremarkable, administrative, the kind of day that belongs to paperwork and follow-through. The federal agents arrived at his Washington office at 7:42 in the morning, while his assistant was still arranging the day's schedule. And by 8 o'clock, the story had reached every major outlet that Ava had sent documentation to. And by 8:15, it had reached every outlet that she hadn't. She watched it from a hotel room in the city she had not named to anyone, on a laptop that was not connected to anything she had touched before, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside her because she had forgotten to drink it. She felt less than she had expected to feel. That was the thing nobody tells you about the moment justice arrives. It does not arrive with music. It arrives like a Tuesday. Quietly, correctly, and with the slightly anticlimactic quality of an ending that has been a long time coming and therefore feels, when it finally comes, more like the closing of a ledger than the resolution of a life. The senator's face on the screen was gray and diminished in the way that powerful men become gray, and diminished the moment the architecture they built around themselves stops holding. He looked, without that architecture, like an ordinary man, which was, in its own way, the most damning thing about him. Ava closed the laptop. She sat with the quiet for a while, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was the first unscheduled silence she had occupied in longer than she could accurately account for, and she let it sit without filling it, without calculating what came next before this moment had finished being what it was. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single message to a number she had memorized rather than stored, because some habits do not dissolve just because the immediate crisis has. It said, it held. The response came in under a minute, which told her he had been waiting, though she suspected he would not have described it that way. It said, I know, come to Chicago. She gave it 3 weeks. Not out of caution. The threat had been neutralized with a thoroughness that Halbrook's remaining associates were still in the process of understanding the full scope of, but out of the conviction that arriving at something important deserves the same care as building toward it. She used the 3 weeks to file the formal documentation that cleared her name with the federal body that had suspended her credentials. She used them to write a 40-page technical analysis of the financial mechanisms that had allowed the senator's network to operate undetected for 7 years, which she submitted without attribution to 2 regulatory bodies and a Senate oversight committee as a framework for closing the structural gaps that had made the scheme possible. She could not help herself. It was simply what she did with information. She turned it into something that would outlast the immediate problem that had surfaced it. This was, she recognized with some amusement, both her greatest professional strength and the quality that had gotten her put on an auction platform in Chicago on what had begun as an unremarkable November evening. She supposed she could not be too resentful of it. Chicago received her on a gray December morning that smelled of the lake and coming snow, and Luca met her not at the penthouse, but at a building she did not recognize, a mid-rise in the River North District, glass and steel, scaffolding still on the upper floors, the particular organized energy of something in the process of becoming rather than already being. He was standing outside it with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat, looking up at the facade with an expression that was not satisfaction and not pride, but something adjacent to both. The expression of a person regarding a decision they have made that is irrevocable, and that they are, upon reflection, at peace with. He looked at her when she approached and said nothing for a moment, which was still one of the more comfortable silences she had encountered in her professional and personal life combined. "What is it?" she said, looking up at the building. "A compliance firm," he said. "Financial forensics, regulatory advisory. The kind of practice that takes on institutional clients who need their structures examined before someone with a federal mandate does it for them." He paused. "Legitimate from the foundation up. Every filing, every contract, every client relationship built to survive scrutiny rather than avoid it." Ava looked at the building for a long moment. She looked at the scaffolding and the uncompleted upper floors and the clean steel lines of something that had not yet become what it was going to be. "And Luca Morti's name is on this," she said. It was not a question. "It is," he said, "alongside the name of the forensic accountant who built the documentation that brought down a sitting United States senator and restructured the federal conversation on shell company disclosure law." He looked at her. "If she is interested." Ava kept looking at the building. She thought about the platform in the foundry and the walk she had taken across that floor and the calculation she had made in 4 seconds that had set every subsequent event in motion. She had chosen Luca Morti because his empire was connected to the system that had destroyed her. She had chosen him because he was the variable she could affect. She had chosen him because she was, at her core, a person who looked at a broken structure and immediately began to understand how it could be rebuilt into something that would not break the same way again. She had not chosen him because she trusted him. Trust, she had concluded somewhere between a panic room and a Wisconsin cabin and a lakefront warehouse, is not a calculation. It is not an asset or a liability. It is not something you arrive at through evidence and analysis, though evidence and analysis are not irrelevant to it. Trust is what remains when you have seen someone at their clearest and most honest, when the architecture they have built around themselves has been pressured enough to show you what is underneath. And you decide that what is underneath is something you can stand next to without looking for the exit. She had seen what was underneath Luca Morti. She had also let him see what was underneath her, in a concrete room in the dark, which was the more significant disclosure of the two. She turned and looked at him. He was still watching her with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has made his position clear and is genuinely comfortable waiting for the other person to arrive at their own conclusion without being pushed toward it. It was, she thought, one of his better qualities. He had several, which she was still in the process of fully cataloging, and which she suspected would take considerably longer than a ledger to document completely. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would," he said. "Full access to every financial structure. Nothing off-limits, nothing pre-cleared before I look at it. If I find something that needs to change, it changes." She held his gaze steadily. "I am not a decoration on this. I am the function." "Yes," he said simply. "That is why I asked you." She looked back at the building one more time. At the scaffolding and the uncompleted floors and the gray December sky sitting above it, with the patient indifference of a city that has seen empires built and come apart and built again on the same ground, generation after generation. By people convinced that this time they would build something that lasted. She thought that this time they might be right. "I have one more condition," she said. "Name it." She looked at him. The coffee in that building had better be significantly better than the penthouse. Luca Morti did not almost smile this time. He smiled. It arrived the way everything about him arrived, unhurried, unannounced, and with the particular quality of something that has been held back long enough that, when it finally surfaces, it is entirely and completely real. Ava looked at the building again, and at the city behind it, and at the lake somewhere beyond the city line, cold and deep and indifferent and enduring. She had walked into the foundry, as someone the system had decided to erase. She was walking into this building as the person who had rewritten the system from the inside, with the only tool that has ever permanently dismantled anything built on dishonesty. The unignorable, fully documented, irrevocably published truth. She walked through the door. And Chicago, in its ancient and unsentimental way, did not pause to mark the moment. It simply continued, loud and cold and alive, around the woman who had just become one of the forces quietly shaping it. Ava Carter walked into the foundry as property. She walked out as the architect of a senator's downfall, the partner of a man who had spent his entire life trusting systems over people, and the living proof of something that does not get taught in any financial accounting program in the country, that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person who controls information is underestimate the mind that produced it. She did not get her old life back. She built a better one. And Luca Morty, for the first time in a very long career of acquiring things with strategic intent, acquired something he had not planned for. He kept it anyway. If this story kept you locked in from the foundry all the way to that Lake Michigan waterfront, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button right now, because it tells us that stories like this are worth building, and we will keep building them. Drop a comment below and tell us, were you Team Ava from the moment she stepped off that platform, or did Luca win you over somewhere along the way? We genuinely want to know where you stood. Share this with someone who needs a great story today, not tomorrow, today. And if you are not subscribed yet, what exactly are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell on, because the next story is already in the works, and you do not want to be the last one in the room. We will see you in the next one.